When it comes to the second Trump administration, the conventional wisdom is this: the only thing predictable about him is his unpredictability. Conventional wisdom also comes in another form. The idea that, well, we had him for 4 years in the past, we know how to deal with Trump. We had him from 2017 to 2020, we can deal with him again. But conventional wisdom is not always right. In fact, if you scratch the surface, there are different schools of thought about what a second Trump administration could mean, and more importantly, there are different schools of thought within the Trump administration. When it comes to Trump, some people say, well, no one really knows what Trump wants. In fact, some doubt what Trump wants himself. He can change his mind at any moment. It depends who whispered in his ears, who was the last person who told him to do X, Y, and Z. But others would say from a historical standpoint, actually Trump is not so unprecedented. In fact, he represents a certain school of thought in American foreign policy, the so-called Jacksonian school, going back to President Andrew Jackson, who in the 19th century was at the forefront of expanding America into a continental-sized nation, very aggressively, very violently, at the expense of indigenous groups, among others. The Jacksonian school, according to historians, is an aggressive school of thought, which believes in peace through strength, meaning the power of deterrence, of strong language, and sometimes limited, calibrated, but decisive use of force. The Jacksonian school is also seen as populist by nature, appealing more to what an average American feels about America's role in the world. And it's not tethered to international alliances, to values, and has a much more transactionalist, or to be fair, pragmatic approach to foreign policy. So in many ways, you can draw a line from Andrew Jackson in the 19th century to Donald Trump in 2025. According to historians, there's another important figure who has also played an important role in shaping Trump's views of foreign policy. And this person actually should be familiar to us in the Philippines, President McKinley. As remember, McKinley was one of the figures who consolidated America's colonization of the Philippines in the early 20th century. And as a president, McKinley also combined two important elements. On one hand, fiscal prudence, belt tightening, cutting down the government's expenditures, making sure that the Americans and the American government specifically can operate on limited budget. That kind of fiscal conservatism is very much reflected in the second Trump administration, even more than its first iteration. For instance, if we look at Elon Musk's so-called DOGE department, it has a lot to do with cutting down expenditures in the federal government. Something that is very controversial and has actually triggered a lot of backlash, including legal complaints from federal employees. But the other element of McKinley's approach to governance, or legacy for that matter, was also expanding the frontiers of the American empire. McKinley in many ways oversaw the consolidation of America's control over much of the Western Pacific, Guam, Hawaii, and most especially the Philippines, the only Asian colony of the United States. How is this relevant to Trump in 2025? Listen to him. Trump easily talks about taking over Greenland or purchasing it from Denmark. Now, of course, Greenland has its own complicated politics. I've been to Greenland recently. I know that people inside Greenland have their own dynamics with Denmark. But nevertheless, Denmark and much of Europe are not very happy with Donald Trump's language on Greenland. Even more controversially, President Trump has spoken about admission or absorption of Canada into the American Union. And he even threatened to impose up to 25% tariffs on Canada, which could have been very devastating. Some estimates would have suggested that up to 500,000 jobs in Canada would have been devastated had Donald Trump pushed ahead with 25% tariffs on Canadian exports to America. Donald Trump has also adopted a very aggressive approach to neighboring Mexico. In the past, he managed to shot up through the rankings within the Republican Party and through the primaries by promising to build a wall. He renamed the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. And more interestingly, or some would say troublingly, he talked about forcible takeover of the Panama Canal because of the fear of China's influence in that part of the world. In many ways, you can say that Donald Trump in 2025 sounds more like 19th century Monroe Doctrine of America. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States essentially said the Western Hemisphere belongs to America and all other external power should keep away. In the 19th century, the United States was doing that to other European powers. In the 21st century, it's doing that to fellow NATO allies and, of course, to rivals like China. And then some would say this Donald Trump could be completely different because, after all, this is Donald Trump that survived multiple assassination attempts. This is Donald Trump that is much more religious, or at least claims to be religious in his outlook. This is Donald Trump that has many religiously driven individuals within his cabinet, including Vice President J.D. Vance. And this is a Donald Trump that could be much more vengeful, much more unhinged, much more aggressive because of what he had to go through, i.e. his claim that the deep state and the Democrats and so-called establishment were after him. Lest we forget, this is a convicted person who is now in the White House. So in many ways, the second Trump administration could be a very different one, something that no one has had to deal with, and something that is still evolving and could present us with more surprises. But let's be honest, no one really knows what Donald Trump's exact algorithm is. Or perhaps his algorithm has evolved over time, considering what he had to go through in the interregnum between his first administration and his second administration. He had 4 years of very interesting experiences. So there's another way to approach the second Trump administration, looking at differing or competing, or to a certain degree, some would say complementary schools of thought within the Trump administration. On one hand, there are the more traditionally minded individuals, such as former Senator and current Secretary of State Marco Rubio, someone who very much believes in an America that leads the world, in an America that has strong alliances, and an America that is willing to stand up to its rivals, most notably China. If you look at statements of other key individuals, such as the newly installed Defense Chief, Hagseth, or National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, they have also emphasized the importance of pivoting to Asia and ensuring that the United States focuses on its challenges when it comes to China. Because after all of these traditionally minded and these very influential individuals in Trump's cabinet, for all of them, China is the number one rival to the United States. And in fact, it's a point of view that is shared across the political spectrum. There is a bipartisan consensus in America, in Washington, D.C., about the threat, or at least the challenge, that China poses to the United States. Whether it's DeepSeek, whether it's BYD, whether it's Huawei, whether it's America's military concerns with China, China's hypersonic missile systems, all of these things suggest that China is the other superpower of the 21st century and is perhaps the only power in recent memory that could end half a millennia of Western hegemony or supremacy in the global order. One of the most influential figures among the more traditionally minded individuals in the Trump administration is Elbridge Colby. He belongs to the so-called prioritizer school of thought. The prioritizers believe that the United States should focus primarily on the number one threat or challenge, which is China, and be much more realistic about entanglements in other parts of the world, especially Europe, with respect to the Ukraine conflict, and also potentially with respect to the Middle East. For prioritizers, the United States should make sure that it is realistic, it is pragmatic, and it's targeted about its external interventions and its defense commitments. If that means ending the war in Ukraine on terms that perhaps will not make Europeans completely happy, if that means cutting a nuclear deal perhaps with Iran that may make some of the regional allies not happy, then so be it, as long as it allows America to focus on the China challenge. In fact, we had Elbridge Colby on this show in earlier seasons when he openly discussed about the importance of Philippines to America's foreign policy and the importance of standing up to China and making sure there's deterrence and there is enough coordination among like-minded powers and allies in this part of the world.
Do you think China has already set its sight on a specific I mean, is there really a grand strategy aside from making sure Americans don't dominate our adjacent waters, which for many sounds reasonable? I mean, you wouldn't want the Russians or Chinese dominate, because sometimes you get suspicious of some people who claim to know what Xi Jinping is exactly thinking, considering there's a lot of dialectical dynamics here. I mean, you don't have to be Marxist to understand that Xi Jinping appreciates Hegelian dialectics very much, right? Kevin Rudd, among others, have noticed that a lot.
Well, I mean, totally. In fact, my analysis is not really based on an assessment of what Xi Jinping actually thinks, or
that there's no 100-year marathon.
Well,
here.
I mean, so you take the arguments of people, people I respect, like Mike Pillsbury, but also people like Rush Doshi, Matt Pottinger, and John Pomfret have made this argument. My argument is deductive and structural. Fundamentally, I think that China is behaving like a typical rising great power. So it's, Graham Allison has this kind of view, which is to say it has John Mearsheimer, it has a strong reason to seek more security and dominance in its own area, because it's good to be the king, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's inevitable. That's why I'm advocating for the positions, because I think we can shape their incentive structure. Now, what I do see from other people who watch what the Chinese say more suggests that they do have a pretty strong plan. I mean, this is a communist government in some ways. 5-year plans made in China 2025, 2039, 2049, 2034. They have a lot of these plans, but I don't think Mao himself was famous for adapting and changing and so forth. So I don't believe that they have like an adamantine fix. On the other hand, Xi Jinping himself personally, now, the military buildup they're doing and the basing structure suggests they have grand ambitions. Xi Jinping himself personally suggests to me a guy with a man of steel kind of personality, his life experience, exactly.
The traumas they went through, personal
all the more the traumas, exactly. I think it hasn't been easy. He's not just the silver spoon, he really went through it, and he's been committed. And look how he's purged and come to dominate his own structure. That worries me. This is a man who will not be easily deflected, and I think that's the impression the Chinese give. So I would say I don't believe war is inevitable, but I believe it's a very serious risk, and it will take a lot of effort and focus for us to deflect him from that course.
Alas, there's another school of thought, actually, within the Trump administration. They are the so-called restrainers. The restrainers are more like 21st century isolationists. These are figures who believe that the United States should be really not interested in any kind of conflict or confrontation with any power, whether Russia, Iran, or even China. For restrainers, America should focus on America, meaning domestic problems, strengthening its industrial foundations. Forget about aid to other countries. Forget about risking American lives for other countries. Forget about getting involved or entangled in potential major wars with other great powers. This is about America looking after its own interest. One of the most influential and consequential restrainers is the man who's now leading South and Southeast Asia Department in Pentagon, the new Deputy Assistant Secretary Andrew Byers. In a couple of important essays last year, just before he got appointed to a top position in the Pentagon, he argued that the way forward is not deterrence vis-a-vis China, but the way forward is a cooperation logic or a cooperation spiral. Troublingly, for countries like the Philippines, he even suggested that perhaps the United States should focus on cutting a deal with China, whereby, for instance, the U.S. will withdraw from its EDCA bases in the Philippines, will withdraw its, let's say, Typhoon missile system and other missile systems. In exchange, all it should ask from China is just to reduce its patrols or aggressive maneuvers in what we call the West Philippine Sea. In short, suggesting some sort of a grand bargain. This is something that we have to take into consideration, that there are influential voices within top positions in the Trump administration who believe in an America that should be much more self-focused, if not more isolationist. And then, of course, there's a curious case of Elon Musk himself. Many see him as the shadow president, although President Trump himself has publicly denied that Elon Musk enjoys any kind of outsized influence in his administration. There was a Time magazine cover recently that tried to portray Elon Musk as the shadow president, as a real man behind the throne, or actually the man on the throne, or the man in the Oval Office. Now, Elon Musk is important because A, he's known to have views that are not necessarily shared by more traditionally minded Republicans. He is accused of having views that more echo, for instance, Russia's way of understanding the world, including the Ukraine conflict. Elon Musk has also been accused of running parallel diplomacy, including playing important role of reaching out to rival powers, for instance, like Iran. But above all, Elon Musk is known for having huge investments in China. In fact, it's hard to see how Tesla could maintain its global competitive edge vis-a-vis the challenge from Chinese electric car companies, if not for Tesla factories in China. In many ways, the survival of Tesla and the business empire that Elon Musk oversees has a lot to do with his relationship with China. In fact, he has very close relationship with Zhong Nanhai and recently even met the premier of China. So it's not only business interest in China, it's also personal relationship with China. And not long ago, he actually promoted a book, a very influential book by Graham Allison, which warned about a potential conflict between US and China and the need to prevent that. So Elon Musk himself will be a major factor in shaping the foreign policy of the second Trump administration, except of course if it's fired by Trump or if he's no longer in office down the road. But so far, Elon Musk is one major factor when it comes to America's foreign policy under second Trump administration. And that's something unique. We didn't have that during the first Trump administration. And Elon Musk himself has dramatically changed over the past few years. And who knows what else he has up his sleeves. So where does that leave the Philippines? In a previous season, actually, we had a conversation with the foreign minister of Poland, Mr. Sikorski, who talked about Poland's emergence as an important power in Europe and the agency, the capability of mid-sized countries to shape their own strategic destiny, if not major events in key theaters such as Europe. Some would argue that the Philippines in many ways is not necessarily the frontline state, meaning Ukraine of Asia, that's probably Taiwan, but the Philippines could be like Poland of Asia. Not Poland of the 19th century or the Poland that disappeared from the map multiple times, but the Poland of the 21st century, which is a mid-sized country, fast-growing economy, and very militarily capable and very diplomatically influential, including influence over Donald Trump. In fact, Trump has very strong relationship with the Polish leadership. And the leadership in Poland is confident about continuously shaping NATO's policy when it comes to Russia. But what should really the Philippines do? Well, in a previous season, we interviewed no less than DFA Secretary Manalo. And one of the things that came out of that interview was this emphasis that the Philippines is dealing with a different China, much more aggressive China. But more importantly, the Philippines is also becoming much more self-reliant and much more independent in its approach to its own interests in the West Philippine Sea.
Secretary, what is the real score? I mean, you served in an interim capacity in the past, acting secretary now, of course. Because I keep on hearing we need diplomacy with China. It's like saying water is wet. Obviously, you need diplomacy with China, but on what terms? Because under the previous administration, I'm not going to put you on the spot. You were just interim back then. You had a president who was willing to give everything, at least on the surface. I remember very well those days and how it put a lot of our cabinet folks that I interviewed also on my shows before on the spot. But what did we get out of what some would see subservient positioning, or at least diffidence, or not so assertive positioning that we saw under President Duterte? That was as diplomacy as it can get in the pedestrian understanding of diplomacy, which is, don't push things, don't provoke things. But I'm not sure we got much out of that those years, because China continued with its militarization of the West Philippine Sea disputes. And not to mention, what happened was not debt trap, because debt trap assumes there's money coming in. What happened was pledge trap, just empty pledges. I mean, where are the big ticket infrastructure investments we were talking about? So what is the real score here? Because I keep on hearing we need more diplomacy. There are even some big business groups here in the Philippines, we don't need to mention their names, almost like gaslighting us for asserting our claim. Parang kasalanan pa natin na we're asserting our claim. So, as a kind of a student of diplomacy and someone who served in very high positions over the past decade, what is the real score here?
Well, if I could speak from my experience, I mean, it's diplomacy is diplomacy, but it's not easy. And diplomacy doesn't mean necessarily giving in to everything doesn't even mean giving in. I mean, you'll never give in. If you reach an agreement, it's essentially a compromise where you take into account each other's interests and see if you can find a solution or an agreement which both of you feel comfortable in.
Or agree to
agreeing
disagree at least.
And of course, agree to disagree. But it's never a case where you give in completely or the other side, because then that's not diplomacy. That's basically
submission. Yeah.
Yes, submission. You don't even need to discuss. But when we discuss in diplomacy, many factors come in. It's just not a simple case of trying to convince the person you're talking, because that person represents a government.
Right.
They don't represent it might be easy for us to talk, and then you might become convinced of the logic of my argument or the reasonableness of my points. But when you start dealing with governments, there are many interests involved there. And it's very difficult to talk to a government and try and convince them of your argument just like that. It takes many days, weeks, months, and there has to be some trade-offs. Otherwise, you don't reach an agreement. And I think the aim of any good diplomat, if there's a task that we have to handle, try and see how we can settle any difference peacefully. But of course, in order to do that, we both have to agree. And until we can find an area of mutual agreement, we either keep on talking or just, as you said, agree to disagree.
Yeah.
I think that's so when I hear the diplomacy, yes, I agree, but it's not simply a case of talking and you'll both agree.
So I push these people, like, are you asking for submission essentially? Because you just spell it out. Because sometimes I really get, because it's like they're saying we're warmongers for just asserting our claims. This is gaslighting. I mean, it's strategic gaslighting. But speaking of strategic gaslighting, one narrative that is coming out from quarters that I think everyone knows what we're talking about here is that President Marcos betrayed an initial promise of pursuing a golden era. And that it's like China is confounded. Like, why is the Philippines doing this to us? Again, what is the real score? Why are our friends in China or their friends in the Philippines implying as if we are the one provoking China in the West Philippines over the past 2 years?
Well, I really can't get that argument because, as I said, we're just exercising our rights. And we made the point, if we're in our area in one shoal or whatever, I mean, I can't see how that poses a threat to the security of China. And
let's say the EDCA bases, for instance, they raise that as an issue, or you're pointing a dagger at us, an American dagger at us.
Well, I think that's partly, as we discussed earlier, the narrative that every action the Philippines takes is because of the United States. We don't seem to have any national interest of our own or any
agency
of our own. It's all at the behest of a certain power. And that's been the continuous refrain. And we've even mentioned this to China that I don't think it's not good if we keep on having that narrative. We have our own interests and we're willing to discuss some resolution, whatever, of differences on the basis of our own interests. And of course, China's interests. And we've made the point that many of these developments are in accordance with our own needs in the Philippines. It's not aimed at China. It's developing our own security, because we live in a very uncertain world, as you know. We can't take things for granted, and there's so many developments now going around the world, in our region and Europe, and then of course the Middle East, that countries really have to learn how to look out for themselves.
So what should we do with all of these uncertainties surrounding the second Trump administration? Well, we cannot control what Trump will do. We don't have much say in how American politics is run, but we can do something about how we run our own foreign policy. And when it comes to running our own foreign policy, there are 3-letter M's that we have to keep in mind. One is middle power. I think the Philippines should get rid of this idea that we're just another small country. We are not. Not only are we one of the fastest growing economies in the world, we are soon to be one of the 30 biggest economies in the world, and down the road by the middle of the century, most likely among the top 10 or top 15 largest economies in this world. At the same time, if you look at our population, we're already in the top 15 countries in the world. Our population is almost as big as Mexico's. And no one says Mexico is a small country. You know, people say a lot of things about Mexico, but they never say it's a small country. Well, we have almost similar population to countries like Mexico. So we are a mid-sized country, increasingly a mid-sized economy, almost $1 trillion economy, or at least within the decade. And we're also investing billions of dollars in modernizing our armed forces. And with launching a comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, what we're trying to do here is to make the Philippines a truly modern 21st century force, militarily, but also in terms of its strategic culture and orientation. The other letter M that we have to keep in mind, aside from increasingly embracing our status as a middle power, is minilateralism. After all, the US is not our only partner. Yes, they're our only treaty ally, but we have very important strategic partners. Japan, for instance, Australia, India, South Korea, France, UK, Germany. Many countries out there are interested in working with us, in sharing with us their defense technology, in co-developing even defense technology. We got the BrahMos supersonic missile system from the Indians. We're going to get even more fighter jets from the South Koreans. The Japanese are helping us with our ISR capabilities. And in fact, we just ratified a reciprocal access agreement with the Japanese, and the Canadians, the French, and others could follow through. In short, we have a whole network of partners and like-minded powers to deal with. And that presents us a huge room for maneuver and could enhance our strategic autonomy. So working with other middle powers through minilateral initiatives, such as the Japan-Philippine-US JAFUS, for instance, Trilateral alliance or framework, is very important. And the last thing we have to keep in mind is the concept of multi-alignment. Meaning, yes, we're a US treaty ally, yes, we're a liberal democratic country, yes, we believe in a rules-based international order, but we have to be also flexible and to be able to work with different powers, with different countries, and in a world that is in the midst of disruption and uncertainty and change. And if that means we have to also strengthen our diplomatic engagement with China in ways that allows us to protect our interests, to hold our line and not to be hostage to the whims of a second Trump administration, if that means having communication channels with other non-Western powers, then so be it. And who knows, maybe we should also have a serious discussion about joining the BRICS and having more productive and substantive and strategic relationship with other emerging powers. In short, this is an era of disruption and challenges, but it's also an era of opportunity and a great chance for us to become a more self-reliant, a more independent-minded, and self-respecting nation. Now, luckily, we actually have someone from the Philippine government to also share his point of view on what a second Trump administration could mean for the Philippines. In what sense is the second Trump administration unpredictable enough for it to be an asset?
Well, if we're going to compare the Trump 1.0 and the behavior of China now, these are completely different variable set. So,
in what sense? Are you saying China is a bigger, more aggressive power now than in 2017, 18, 19, 20?
It's because during the time of President Trump,
First Trump
administration, we are very silent about the aggression of
this is Duterte era.
Yeah,
So you're
Duterte
saying because back then you had the President Duterte element, which was moving in a very different direction, but now you have President BBM, which is very aligned in terms of a rules-based international order. China is facing a completely different dynamic.
Yes, that is the
Interesting.
the complicatedness of a
Interesting.
Trump administration right now. President Bongbong Marcos never backs down, as he has always been mentioning.
Right.
We're not going to yield, and we're going to
Interesting.
maintain our transparency efforts. And those transparency efforts do not just resonate among U.S. Senators, whether they are Republican or Democrat.
It's bipartisan.
It's bipartisan. So I think this kind of efforts that we do in the West Philippine Sea, the Chinese government can never predict how President Donald Trump will decide or come up with an action that would address a certain incident that they're going to come up with.
You forgot to mention one very important figure. There was no J. Tarriela in charge of speaking for the West Philippine Sea issue. And there was no transparency initiative, obviously. back then. So that is a complicating factor, right? And then obviously a lot has changed since then. There's a Ukraine war, there's which you can interpret it in different ways. There's a conflict in the Middle East. So what you're saying is that Donald Trump, yes, there was a 4 years, but China would be foolish to think we're gonna see the same thing
Yep.
because everything has changed, especially the Philippines also approach to the West Philippine Sea. Now, the fact of the matter is that U.S. is no longer our like 90% of our foreign defense policy, right? We finalized a reciprocal access agreement. We ratified it a few months ago. You just came from Japan recently. You took your PhD in Japan. It's a country you're very much familiar with, perhaps too much samurai spirit you absorbed throughout those years of PhD that may explain your Twitter proactiveness, among others. How important are these alternative allies or partners? I mean, Japan is almost an ally to us, right? I mean, it's just short of a treaty alliance, right? At every level, we have a very, very deep relationship with China, economic, strategic, and in terms of Coast Guard, right? They have been very helpful in helping us to go to the next level in terms of Philippine Coast Guard. Can you talk about Japan, the other big ally of the Philippines?
Well, the Japanese government, even during the time, way back during the
Yeah.
time President Noynoy Aquino,
Right.
when he came to visit Prime Minister Abe a year after the Scarborough Shoal
Yeah.
standoff, and requesting the Japanese Prime Minister to use ODA
Right.
to support our acquisition of 10 44-meter vessels and the 297-meter vessels. It just showed how the Japanese government developed a Coast Guard capability that we are using right now. So try to imagine if you have President Bongbong Marcos, who is all out standing up against against China in encroaching our exclusive economic zone, the West Philippine Sea, and also have possible relationship with the Japanese Prime Minister, the Australians as well, and other like-minded states. And you have Donald Trump, who is very unpredictable.
Yeah.
I don't think that President Xi Jinping would be very more, hostile when it comes to their strategy in the West.
Or at least he has to be a bit more careful. Now, this is very important, right? Because the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe essentially had a decade to transform Japan. And Japan, whether current Prime Minister Ishiba or Kishida previously, this is a Japan that is also very different, right? From Japan of a decade ago or even half a decade ago, right? This is Japan that is doubling its defense spending as a share of GDP. This is a Japan that is doubling down on its security cooperation with the U.S. And then, of course, what we have now is what I call JAFUS. It rhymes with AUKUS, right? Japan, Philippine, U.S. Trilateral, right? How important is this element? Because it's not all about U.S., but at the same time, there's also this kind of trilateral and more minilateral coordination with other like-minded powers. How important that is in terms of helping us in the West Philippine Sea?
The Japanese variable in understanding the U.S. and the region alliance is that the Japanese government has a positive foreign relations with Southeast Asian countries.
Right.
So if there's one country,
And they're Asians like us,
yeah,
quote unquote.
and
yeah.
we're Asians.
Yeah.
If there's one country that can support the influence of the United States towards our neighbors, that would be the Japanese government. The Japanese government also supported Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia for their
Coast Guard.
Coast
Yeah.
Guard
Yeah.
development. So that's how important Japan is. We don't see Japan as a competitor of China for great power competition. We see Japan as our partner for security and economic prosperity. So U.S. has to really rely on Japan in influencing not the Philippines, because that's not a problem for U.S., but our neighbors, to make sure that all of us are aligned together to call out the Chinese bullying behavior in the entire South China Sea.
So if the U.S. is Big Brother, they're the middle brother, or if the U.S. is Batman, they're the Robin to the Batman. Because to be fair to Japan, Japan is also autonomously acting as a regional force, right? It's not like they're getting calls from Trump, hey, go and do this. Japan has very deep and profound and very self-interested ideas because its own national security is at stake, right? Because if South China Sea is compromised, then Taiwan is compromised, then Senkaku could be compromised, right? So Japan is a resident power. They have direct states here, and you absolutely mentioned correct that they're also very much invested in ASEAN. In the case of Coast Guard, the other year we had former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Kishida here, and he gave a speech before the Joint Congress in the Philippines, historic, and then of course new Coast Guard vessels from Japan are on board. Can you tell us a little bit about those? How important were the defense assistance, even because it's not just development. Now there's also overseas defense assistance from Japan. How
OSA.
OSA, exactly. Security
overseas
assistance,
yeah, yeah.
overseas security assistance. We're one of the first four, right, beneficiaries of that. In terms of Coast Guard, how relevant is that Japan factor?
Well, I won't talk about the OSA for the Armed Forces of the Philippines because
No, this is clearly just Coast Guard.
for the Coast Guard, we're using ODA.
Oh, you're
because-
still. Oh, yeah, of course.
because
of
the
course,
Coast Guard is considered not to be part of the military. Or
But the two can
supplement.
complement each other,
Yeah.
right? Of course.
But
yeah.
for the ODA that the Japanese government provided the Philippine Coast Guard, from small boats to radars to MDA capability, this help really is tremendous for our capability. If there's no Japan, there are no Coast Guard vessels that we can deploy right now. The French government has supported the Philippine Coast Guard, but it's only 183 meter and 424 meter vessels. We are still reliant on those 12 Coast Guard vessels that were acquired during the time Prime Minister Abe and President Noynoy Aquino.
And what are these? I mean, how big, how important, these are modern ones. These are big ones,
Yeah,
right?
the 297 meter vessels and the 1044 meter vessels. And these are the vessels that we deploy in the West Philippine Sea to counter Chinese aggression.
And could you confidently say that the Philippine Coast Guard, of course, China is a different league, but among our ASEAN peers, we are very much one of the most modernized and proactive Coast Guards.
Yeah,
Can you say that? Yeah.
Yeah, we can argue right now
Yeah.
that the Philippine Coast Guard, because of the support of the Japanese government, allowed us to modernize and to be more capable. Because the vessels that they have provided are not actually hand-me-down vessels.
No, they're new.
These
they're
are
brand
brand new vessels, and as a matter of fact, the 97 meter vessels that we are now having, the BRP Teresa Magmanua and the BRP Belchor Aquino, are also patterned before the Kunigami class of the
Right.
Japanese Coast Guard, the vessels that they're using in patrolling Senkaku Islands.
And last point, obviously, it's not only Japan and US too, right? The French, more Europeans are getting involved here. Obviously, the Indians also are having more and more cooperation with us, generally in maritime security. And of course, Australia has been,
Canadian as well.
and Canadians obviously have been helping also in terms of ISR and domain awareness, among other capabilities. Are we looking at, because a while ago we discussed minilateralism, right? Trilateral. Are we looking at more multi-alignment and more middle powers coming together, like all of these letter M's, right, that are very important? So in as much as you remain optimistic about second Trump administration, what you're saying is that we're also expanding, right?
Yep.
In terms of other alliances and partnerships.
Well, I think it's not just about the multilateral engagement.
Right.
I think it's more of those like-minded states that understand that what China is doing is they're the one endangering the rules-based order. That all the countries in the world has to step up to make sure that China will respect international law, that China will fall in line and preserve the order that we have right now. There are so many instances that China has been saying that they're going to rewrite the international order because they're not happy about it,
Yeah.
or that there is loophole about it. But that is the reason why all of these countries now are stepping up. It's not just about the U.S. Calling their allies to support the Philippines, but individually, these states understood the fact that they need to do something for the Philippines. Our fight for the West Philippine Sea is not about our own sovereignty. This is the fight for all countries that wants to preserve the rules-based order.
So, I mean, to be a little bit cheeky about it, this is our community of shared destiny, right? To use the Chinese. This is the harmonious community we're trying to build.
Or the right-minded people.
Right? Well, on that note, thank you very much,
Thank you very
Commodore
much.
Tarriela, for that really 360 degrees discussion of the West Philippine Sea challenges and what is the Philippines doing to move in the right direction. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Hidarian, and that was The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.